So getting back to your book, so this concept of a higher power. So I don't know, how did you come to terms, and how do you ended up settling on a definition of what, to sort of leave that Christian centric God definition, and have you replaced that with something in that you think works?
So the term higher power and higher and friendly power or powers comes from the American philosopher and psychologist William James in his book his 1902 book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. So there's an intellectual story to be told here. So Bill Wilson was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. So in 1934, he went to the Charles B. Towns Hospital in New York, and he's utterly defiant. He's broken, and he screams, if there is a God, show yourself. I'll do anything to have this desire to drink be lifted from me. And the story goes, he felt this gust of wind, and suddenly his desire to drink was lifted. And so not long after, he's worried, am I going crazy? Which would make sense because he was probably going through acute alcohol withdrawal, probably hallucinating from that. And they used belladonna at the time, which could also induce hallucination. So he's got a twofer going here. And a friend gave him William James's Varieties of Religious Experience to understand what had happened to him as a kind of conversion. Now, here's the interesting thing. I would take it as a definitive treatment of the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's called Writing the Big Book. Came out about 2 years ago. Schaberg is the author's name. And that story may be a bit of mythology on the part of Bill Wilson. Maybe it didn't really happen like that, but every program that's founded needs a good origin story that functions like a mythology. Yep. So in Varieties that Bill Wilson did read, we know he read it at least once and maybe another couple of times. Many of the stories in there are people who undergo a similar kind of tsunami-like conversion for him, where suddenly something happens that is so big and grand that a fundamental experience, a change like that, must have been authored by something external to the person. It feels like a God just swooped in. So, the paradigm cases, Saul riding to Damascus and he gets knocked off the horse, and then he becomes Paul and he becomes a Christian. And Bill Wilson said, that's kind of what happened to me with drinking. And so in James's Varieties, though, he talks about what Bill Wilson, he describes the sort of experience that Bill Wilson has as a conversion. And what James says is that, the only thing we know about a conversion is that it's a psychological process. It feels like it must be caused by something because it seems to come out of the blue. It's not like we consciously thought of it and then we change, but it's something just kind of flows through us. And he said, but the most we're licensed to say is it's a psychological conversion. And he goes on to say, people who really do want to change, oftentimes they've been thinking about this. In the back of my head, I had the voice at first saying a whisper, you got a problem, you drink too much. And then the whisper shout, you drink too much. And then the real shout in my head. And what James says is that thoughts and feelings can come unbidden from the subconscious and they burst through. And that's what a conversion is. And he goes on to say that people who are ready for a conversion oftentimes understand sort of how their present ways of living are wrong or incomplete or making them dreadfully unhappy. But they also have to have something that his expression is they long to compass. You've got to have a positive ideal of some sort. You've got to have something that is just a little bigger and better to kind of grapple hook your way towards. And that's what he calls a higher and friendly power. And he says anything can be a higher and friendly power. Anything larger will do. So some of the examples that James offers comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was William James's intellectual godfather, talking about the transcendental ideals of truth and beauty, something bigger than you. He said moral decency, your moral principles, enthusiasm for humanity. He says the belief in an immanent divinity of nature, even a better version of yourself. All of those things, he says, are expansive. They help a person both reach out of their own little embattled selves to something bigger out there, or it helps them to reach inward to themselves to find something more expansive there that helps them to begin to reach out and expand rather than contract. And when you think about the ways that addiction makes many of us contract our lives, so if things start to get in the way of our using, if friends are always hassling us, like, you drink too much, we tend to drop those friends. Or we tend to drop activities, maybe, if they're going to interrupt our using. So our world, addiction, oftentimes our world shrinks in a kind of way.
You move more inward.
Recovery is a kind of expansion or inflation of that world again. But it happens from people changing drastically. And James is very clear, though, that there are just as many there's just as many gradual conversions as there are the sudden ones. The sudden ones are big and flashing. They capture our attention. And much of, particular, in Catholicism, the saints, those people who undergo remarkable transformation and they suffer in all these kinds of ways. And, their spiritual impulses burn so brightly. What James says is many people have profound experiences and changes in their life that have happened very slowly and gradually as a result of making small changes incrementally, but the result is just as big. And so I think that's really important for people struggling with addiction. So if you have read the book Alcoholics Anonymous, called The Big Book, Bill Wilson talks about his own experience very early on. And I know many people early in sobriety might say, but I never had that big aha kind of tsunami moment. Maybe I'm really not an alcoholic, or maybe I'm really not an addict. Maybe I don't really belong here. And Bill Wilson understood the way that his story functioned normatively or prescriptively. So he did later write a second appendix called Spiritual Experiences, I think it is, where he talked about those more gradual kinds of conversions, because that's what many people have who do change their relationship to alcohol and other drugs and other kinds of behaviors. So this book, Higher and Friendly Powers, is really also intended to offer more options about what a higher and friendly power can be. There are as many higher and friendly powers as there are individuals in the world. It's up for us to decide what can function in that way, and that may change over time, because we humans are always changing. And that's the really good news. That's a really exciting news.